November 14th, 1989. The kind of day where the air feels sharper than it should, the clouds hanging low enough to touch the roof of the old nursery on the corner of Harrow Street. The wind rattled the loose shutters in a slow, uneven rhythm, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, then fell silent. Inside the nursery, the faint scent of crayons and floor polish still lingered, though no children's laughter broke the stillness. By dusk, the building's front door would be locked, its lights dark. And one of the people who had been inside that morning would never be seen again. Her name was Margaret Ellis, 32 years old, known to everyone in town as Miss Maggie, the gentle soul who knew every child's favorite toy by heart. That day began as every other Tuesday had for years. She arrived early, brewed a pot of weak coffee in the small staff kitchen, and laid out picture B. Ooks on the reading rug. There was nothing in her expression to suggest anything was wrong, no urgency in her step, no shadow in her smile. The last confirmed sighting came at 4:12 p.m. when the final parent collected their child. Margaret waved from the doorway, a folded coat draped over her arm, the pale November light spilling around her. Minutes later she was gone. No one heard her leave, no one saw which direction she walked. And for days after, the only thing left behind was that building, standing silent at the edge of town, holding on to a secret it would not give up for. Decades before she became the name whispered in half-finished sentences, Margaret Ellis was simply the heartbeat of Harrow Street's nursery. She had grown up just 2 towns over, the middle child in a family of 5, with a knack for coaxing even the shyest toddler into laughter. She never married, though she'd had a handful of quiet romances in her 20s, the sort that ended without bitterness, just a drifting apart. People said she preferred the company of children, not because she was lonely, but because she saw the world in their colors. She knew how to turn a rainy afternoon into an adventure with nothing more than a cardboard box and a set of finger paints. Margaret's daily routine was almost ritual. She would arrive before sunrise, unlocking the front gate with a set of brass keys worn smooth from years of use. She'd walk through each room, straightening chairs, smoothing blankets in the nap corner, checking that the toy shelves were neat and complete. She liked the smell of the place before anyone arrived, that mix of wood polish, paper, and something faintly sweet from the staffroom biscuits. On Mondays, she wore a navy cardigan with a frayed cuff, on Fridays a floral blouse that reminded her of her mother. The week before she vanished, she had bought a small set of wooden building blocks from the town's second-hand shop. They were hand-painted, the colors chipped at the edges, and she told a colleague she liked them because they already had stories in them. That same colleague would later recall how, in those last days, Margaret seemed unusually preoccupied, sometimes staring out the window as if waiting for something or someone to appear. She never explained what was on her mind. Children adored her, parents trusted her. In a town where most people had known each other for generations, Margaret was as much a fixture as the church steeple or the post office clock. Which is why when she failed to show up one Wednesday morning, it wasn't just strange, it was impossible to believe. It began subtly, the way unease often does, a passing remark here, a strange pause there. In early November, just 2 weeks before she vanished, Margaret had been overheard telling Mrs. Linton, one of the mothers, that she'd been sleeping poorly because of late-night noises coming from the street outside the nursery. When pressed, she'd laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or teenagers cutting through the alley. But those who knew her best said her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Colleagues began noticing she was locking the side door earlier than usual, even before all the children had been collected. Once on a drizzly Thursday, she asked Peter, the handyman, if the building's back gate could be fitted with a heavier latch. He assumed it was to keep stray cats from wandering in. She didn't correct him. One afternoon, while tidying the reading corner, she found a small paper crane folded from a page torn out of a phone book. It was sitting on top of a stack of coloring books, and no one could say how it got there. Margaret slipped it into her pocket without a word, though later that day she was seen holding it tightly while she stood by the window, watching the Street, a few of the older children mentioned a tall man they had seen in the yard after school, standing near the fence. When staff checked, no one was there. Margaret brushed off the stories as make-believe, but she started walking to the bus stop with another teacher instead of alone. To those around her, it might have seemed like nothing more than a string of small, disconnected moments. But when pieced together later, these fragments painted a far more troubling picture, one of a woman who had begun to feel that something or someone was drawing closer. It was Tuesday, November 14th, 1989, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. By mid-afternoon, a thin mist had rolled in from the river, softening the outlines of the houses and turning the nursery's front yard into a blur of pale shapes inside. The day moved at its usual rhythm, coats zipped, mittens tugged on, picture books returned to their shelves. At 4:05 p.m. the last child was picked up, a little boy named Daniel who waved sleepily as his mother led him away. Margaret stood at the doorway, returning the wave with a small, tired smile. She was seen again a few minutes later by Mrs. Hale from across the street. The older woman had been closing her curtains when she noticed Margaret step out of the nursery, coat folded neatly over her arm instead of wearing it. She didn't appear to be in a hurry, but there was something unusual. She kept glancing toward the alley that ran between the nursery and the old bake. Mrs. Hale thought she saw a figure there, tall and still, but when she blinked, the mist had swallowed the space. At 4:17 p.m. the nursery's front door clicked shut. No one heard footsteps on the pavement, no car engine started. Just the creak of the sign above the door swaying in the wind. A delivery driver passing through town later claimed he saw a woman matching Margaret's description walking along the edge of the woods half a mile off. Her coat still folded in her arms, but by the time anyone checked, there was no trace. That evening, the lights inside the nursery remained off. By morning, Margaret's keys were found on the staff room counter, her handbag on the chair where she always left it, and her bus pass resting on top. It was as though she had stepped outside for a moment and been erased from the world. The search began before the frost had melted from the grass. By sunrise on November 15th, police cars idled along Harrow Street, their radios crackling with clipped voices. Officers moved quickly, knocking on doors, showing Margaret's photograph, a smiling woman in a patterned blouse, her hair caught mid-laugh. Volunteers from the town joined in, some still in their work clothes, others with dogs straining at their leashes. They combed the narrow alley beside the nursery, the overgrown garden behind the bakery, and the small patch of woodland that hugged the river. Detective Alan Price, newly transferred from the city, took charge of the case. He spoke calmly to the press, saying they were treating the matter with urgency, though privately he admitted the scene inside the nursery troubled him. Nothing was disturbed, no sign of a struggle, her belongings neatly in place as if she had simply stepped out for a breath of air. By the second day, they expanded the search. Boats drifted along the gray surface of the river, probing with long poles. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the quiet. Flyers were tacked to lampposts and taped to shop windows, Margaret's face watching over the streets she had walked for years. The local radio station interrupted its music to broadcast appeals from her sister, Claire, who spoke in a voice tight with strain. If anyone has seen her, please come forward. Leads trickled in, each one pulling searchers in a different direction. A farmer thought he spotted someone matching her description crossing his field at dawn. A delivery man swore he'd seen her on the main road heading west. Both claims dissolved after a few questions. Still, the search went on into the cold, damp evenings, the volunteers returning home with mud on their boots and no answers in their hands. By the end of the first week, the urgency had shifted into something heavier, a quiet determination, shadowed by the first hints of doubt. Margaret was somewhere out there, but with every passing hour, the edges of that certainty began to fray. Winter settled in before anyone realized how much ground had been lost. The days grew shorter, the search parties smaller. By mid-December, the bright yellow flyers that once caught the eye were faded and curling at the edges, rainwater blurring the ink until Margaret's C was little more than a ghostly outline. Detective Price still held weekly briefings, but the room felt emptier each time, fewer reporters, fewer new leads. The false sightings had worn people down. In 1 week alone, police chased 3 separate tips: a woman seen boarding a coach to London, another entering a seaside boarding house, and a third walking along a country road in a heavy coat. None of them were Margaret. The cost, in hours, in morale, was beginning to show. Inside the station, the investigation board was a patchwork of photographs, hand-drawn maps, and scribbled notes. Red string connected places she'd been to places she might have gone, but too many of the lines led nowhere. Claire, her sister, stopped attending the evening briefings. She told a neighbor she couldn't bear to hear the words "no developments" again. Even the town's mood began to shift. At first, people had left porch lights burning in case Margaret found her way home in the dark. By February, most of those lights were off. Conversations about her grew shorter, replaced by the ordinary concerns of bills, weather, and work. Yet there was an unspoken unease, a sense that something unfinished hung over the street where the nursery stood. By spring, Detective Price recommended scaling back the search. He promised the family the case wasn't closed, only paused, but everyone knew what that meant. Margaret had not been found, no body, no trace. Just a locked building, a handful of unanswered questions, and the creeping certainty that whatever had happened was now far beyond their reach. It was almost 25 years later when the first real movement came. In the summer of 2014, the Harrow Street Police Station was clearing out its evidence room, boxing up old files for transfer to the county archives. Among the dust-coated folders and sealed envelopes, retired officer Brian Coles found a small cardboard box marked in fading ink, "Nursery, 1989." Inside, beneath a stack of Polaroid photographs, lay a single brass key attached to a worn tag. The handwriting on the tag read, "Nursery storage, do not open." Coles almost set it aside, assuming it had long since lost relevance, but something about the note gnawed at him. The nursery building had been locked and left to the council after Margaret's disappearance, its main rooms cleared, its utilities shut off. No one, as far as he knew, had ever mentioned a separate storage room. Curiosity got the better of him. He called the current property officer, a woman named Helen Partridge, and asked if she knew of such a space. She didn't, but she did confirm the building was still standing, still boarded up, its paint peeling in long curls. Within a week, they arranged to meet there, the key resting in Cole's pocket for the first time in decades. When the day came, the building felt frozen in another time. The main hall was as empty as expected, dust motes swirling in the beams of sunlight that cut through broken blinds. But in the back corner, half hidden behind a leaning bookshelf, they found a door. The wood was scuffed, the handle tarnished. Coles fit the key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, reluctant click, the sound echoing in the hollow space. No one said a word. What lay behind that door had been waiting a very, very long time. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled faintly of old paper and something sweeter like dust cling. Ing to forgotten fabric, Helen clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting across a room no bigger than a single classroom. What they saw made them stop where they stood. Tiny wooden chairs were arranged in a loose circle, as if a group of children had just been called away mid-game. A half-finished puzzle lay on the floor, one piece turned upside down. Coloring books were stacked neatly on a low table, their pages frozen in mid-crayon stroke. A red rubber ball rested against the wall, its surface dulled but still bright enough to catch the light. It was as though the room had been sealed on the very afternoon Margaret disappeared, every object exactly where it had been left. No dust thick enough to suggest decades had passed, no signs of rodents or decay. The air felt still in a way that made Helen shift uncomfortably. Brian walked slowly toward the small teacher's desk in the corner, his footsteps muffled by the thin rug. The drawers were locked, but the second key on the brass ring fit perfectly. Inside the top drawer, wrapped in a strip of floral cloth, was a bundle of envelopes tied with twine. They were addressed to M.E. in a hand neither of them recognized. The letters were dated in the weeks before November 1989. Most were brief, almost hurried. Phrases like "you need to be careful" and "I think they know" appeared again and again. One in particular stood out, a single sheet that read, "Meet me before the end of the month. The nursery is not what you think it is." Helen looked at Brian, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Do we call this in now?" He nodded, though neither of them moved right away. It felt like speaking too loudly might wake something that had been sleeping in that room for a very long time. The days that followed felt heavy, as though an invisible weight pressed against my chest. Conversations were shorter. Even when we were in the same room, our words seemed to skim the surface, never sinking into the deeper waters where we used to meet. I caught him looking at me a few times like he wanted to say something, but each time his eyes darted away. One evening, after the rain had cleared, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching the wet grass glisten under the fading light. The air smelled of earth and pine. I heard the creak of the screen door and the soft thud of footsteps. It was Daniel. He sat beside me, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low, "about how quickly things can change and how easily we can lose sight of what really matters." I turned to him, but he didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph, creased at the edges, the colors slightly faded. It was of us, years ago, standing in front of the small cabin we used to visit every summer. We looked sunburned, messy-haired, and impossibly happy. "Do you remember this day?" he asked. I nodded. We'd gotten lost on the hiking trail, ended up at that lake we didn't even know existed. He smiled faintly, "And you said maybe getting lost wasn't such a bad thing." We sat in silence for a while, letting the sound of dripping leaves and distant crickets fill the space between us. There was no grand apology, no sudden breakthrough. Just the quiet understanding that some things, once broken, take time to mend, if they can mend at all. The porch light flickered on as the sun disappeared. Daniel stood, gave my shoulder a light squeeze, and went inside. I stayed out a bit longer, holding onto the photograph, the damp air clinging to my skin, wondering which parts of us could still be found. The air in the small diner felt heavier than usual, though nothing about the morning rush seemed different on the surface. Dishes clinked, the low hum of conversation filled the space, and the coffee pot hissed with every refill. But at the corner booth, Clara sat alone, her fingers tracing the rim of a mug gone cold. She hadn't touched her breakfast, and her eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the parking lot as though waiting for someone who should have been there by now. When the bell above the door finally chimed, it wasn't him. It was just a delivery man dropping off boxes. She sighed, leaning back against the vinyl seat. The phone in her bag had been silent since the night before, and the last message she'd received was a simple "I need to tell you something." That had been hours before his disappearance. A few minutes later, the waitress, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile, topped off Clara's coffee. "You sure you're all right, hun?" she asked gently. Clara forced a small smile and nodded, though her voice caught as she replied, "Yeah, just a long night." She didn't elaborate, and the waitress didn't press her. Outside, the sky was shifting into the pale gray of late morning, but Clara's thoughts were still tangled in the events of the past day, the unanswered calls, the strange way his jacket had been left hanging on the back of a chair, and the fact that his car was still in the driveway. It wasn't like him to vanish without a word. She glanced again at the door, her heart tightening in that strange, expectant way, but the diner stayed quiet. The world around her moved on, forks scraping plates, coffee pouring, laughter from a table nearby, but for Clara, every second stretched too long, as though time itself had slowed, holding her in that booth with nothing but questions and the weight of silence. In the end, some answers never came, and perhaps they never will. But the echoes of what happened that day still linger in the dusty photographs, the faded notes, and the uneasy memories of those who were there. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary places can hold secrets deeper than we imagine. If this story has stirred something in you, share it with someone who might remember a detail. Leave your thoughts in the comments and let's keep the conversation alive. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss the next one. Because sometimes the next clue comes when you least expect it.